Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcel Rodardi, coming to you live from the California Contract Cities classrooms at the Contract Law Enforcement Bureau at the LA Sheriff's Department. Today, we're going to be talking about Contract Law 101, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Liability Trust Fund, its inception, its existence, its funding mechanisms, and why it exists and why it's important to you to know how it works and why it works and what isn't working for us sometimes. So with no further ado, I'm going to introduce this year's president for the California Contract Cities Association, Lindsay Horvath.
Thanks so much, Marcel, and thanks to everyone who's participating with us live, as well as everyone who will be watching as we're recording this for you to be able to watch after we have this discussion. But it's so incredibly important that we're taking the time for this conversation. I want to thank our partners at LA County Sheriff's Department for making the time to have this conversation with us. We know that so many cities are now seeing new elected officials, whether because of term limits or just, political change. And those of us who have been around a little bit understand how some of these things work a little bit better. But for everybody, it's always helpful to have a refresher on how our relationship with the Sheriff's Department, for those cities that contract with them, how that came to be, how it serves our cities. And we know in many of our communities that we would not financially be able to exist as cities and provide the services and support that we like to do for our community, and have our own law enforcement division. And so we have this great partnership with LA County Sheriff's Department. This has allowed our communities to stay safe, to have personnel in our communities who are addressing those concerns on a daily basis, and still be able to manage our budgets, which is so critically important for all of us as local electeds, especially in this really difficult time. So this should help us understand how we got here, how it works, and better inform how we're able to have a conversation around the things that we're talking about when it comes to public safety in our communities. And once again, want to thank everyone at the Sheriff's Department, all of our staff at Contract Cities who made today's conversation possible, and everyone who works at the Liability Trust Fund, Claims Board and Oversight Committee, to make sure that we're having these conversations and holding ourselves accountable. So without further ado, I'll turn it back to Marcel.
Thank you, Lindsay. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. We have several folks from LA Sheriff's Department Contract Law Enforcement Bureau, as I mentioned. We also have the Executive Director of the California Joint Powers Insurance Authority, which oversees the funding for the Liability Trust Fund. And so real quick, Captain Sergio Escobedo, he's the current Unit Commander of the Contract Law Enforcement Bureau, CLEB. As Unit Commander of CLEB, Captain Escobedo oversees more than $850 million in contract law enforcement service. So cities aren't the only contracts with the Sheriff's Department. You have Metro, you have some community colleges, and you have some other entities, organizations out there that do contract with the Sheriff's Department. So we are the largest piece of that, but we're not the only piece of that. And so Captain Escobedo oversees the entirety of that group. Here it is right here. So includes the local cities, Metro, LA community colleges, and multiple county departments. 25-year veteran of the department, Captain Escobedo has served in a number of roles, including assignments at Men's Central Jail, Pico Rivera Station, and the offices of the Assistant Sheriff and the Office of the Undersheriff. Captain Escobedo has an associate degree from Don Bosco Technical Institute and a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Cal State Fullerton. Next, Lieutenant Brian Aguilera is a 17-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department. He began his career working in the North County Correctional Facility, as well as the administrative arm of the Custody Division. He has served in a number of communities, including Palmdale, Lancaster, West Hollywood, Santa Clarita, where he served as watch commander. And finally, from the department, we have Lieutenant Gerardet, I'm sorry if I butchered that first name, Montoya. Lieutenant Montoya is an 18-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department. He began his career working in North County, I jumped to the wrong one. 18-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department. Over the years, she has served in a number of capacities: Century Regional Detention Facility, Marina Del Rey Station, and Custody Support Services. Lieutenant Montoya recently joined Contract Law Enforcement Bureau. Lieutenant Montoya has a master's degree in public administration from National University and a master's degree in marriage and family therapy from Cal State LA, which I'm sure comes in handy quite a bit dealing with the community at large. And finally, our next speaker is from California JPIA. John Scholl is the Chief Executive Officer of the California Joint Powers Authority. John has served in his capacity for over 25 years since 1995. Under John's leadership, the authority launched its first website, transformed training from a simple member benefit to a holistic loss prevention strategy, and implemented a new prospective funding model that has positioned the insurance pool to maintain a strong financial position while providing stability to members. John has previously worked for various local governments, including the cities of Cerritos and Signal Hill. John earned both his bachelor's and master's degree from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo and the Maxwell School at Syracuse University, respectively. The CJPIA is one of the largest municipal self-insurance pools in California. For over 40 years, CJPIA has served over 100 public agencies, providing various liability and risk management services, including workers' comp, pollution, and property coverage. And with that, I will turn it over to the Contract Law Enforcement Bureau folks. You guys are gonna have to unmute. I muted you.
Okay, thank you, Marcel. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to your staff and yourself for inviting us to this platform to provide some information regarding contract law and its basic function. Thank you and welcome all the attendees today on this platform. First of all, I'd like to introduce two senior contract managers present also. Rudy Sanchez, I don't know if you could see him, and Sergeant Julie Lowe. There are two senior, you see their hands. Unfortunately, our camera system is not, doesn't have a wide lens, but again, Brian Aguilera to my right and Lieutenant Jerry Montoya to his right. But again, we welcome this opportunity to provide some valuable information to our city managers and any other elected or appointed officials on this platform. As you all know, this whole contracting model started back in 1954 with the incorporation of Lakewood, City of Lakewood. It was called the Lakewood Plan back in '54, and it consisted of collecting fines and forfeitures to pay for contracted services with the Sheriff's Department. In fiscal year 57-58, the contract cost model was established by the county with rates adjusted annually by the auditor controller. So that cost model went through some changes in the late 60s. The Board of Supervisors developed a more comprehensive contract model, which went through legislative and negotiated changes back in 73, 1974, and 82, which became our current foundation for today's cost model. So our cost model is and has been the gold standard throughout our southern counties and northern counties, including some of our eastern state partners. We normally get inquiries every year from outside eastern states, as far as Chicago, looking to see how we do business. We are the leader in this industry, and we are constantly being tasked with providing data to other counties throughout the nation to establish their own contracting models for their services. Just to give you a little background on the Bureau itself, we are located at HOJ, which is our Sheriff's headquarters. We're on the 7th floor. Our Bureau consists of 8 budgeted sergeants. They are your contract managers. We currently have 7. We have 1 vacancy, but our 7 managers manage all 42 contract cities and all other public and private entity contracts that we receive throughout the year. As Marcella already mentioned, we do Metrolink, Transportation Bureau, community colleges, our county buildings, and trial court. Our trial court security is managed through us. And so we have numerous contracts that equate to a little less than $1 billion in revenue offset that we manage. We do have 11 professional staff that are assigned to our Bureau that assist with billings and processing all our supplemental law enforcement services that we receive throughout the year. Jared de Montoya is our newest member of our team. She's managing our unincorporated area contracts. So she has the oversight of all unincorporated areas in the county. And Brian Aguilera, he's the operations lieutenant, and he's also managing has the oversight of all our contract cities. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Brian. I know we have a short time here to get a whole 8-hour session within 25 minutes, so I'll turn it over to Brian to start the program. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. As Captain mentioned, we generally drag this thing out over several hours. So it's a long presentation. We're going to compact it as much as we can. But with that being said, we're available to provide this presentation to any city at any time. We just did one last week for a bunch of the cities down on the peninsula, just to provide them with more information about what we do. So if we're not able to get into detail on something that you'd like to review today, we'd be more than happy. Just reach out to us and we'll provide it to you. As the captain mentioned, we started in 1954 with the incorporation of the city of Lakewood. Currently, the Sheriff's Department provides service for 42 of the 88 contract cities. And if I can get the next slide, please. The cost savings are based on economies of scale on our consolidated model. What's interesting is that all the cities pay the same rates regardless of service or size level. If you could hit it again, that'd be great. Thank you, Marcel. The local control is through the city manager, so somewhat similar to how an independent police department would work. All of our cities are either going to have some sort of service area manager or a direct incorporation with the station captain for their patrol area. And if we could hit it again, please. The Sheriff's Department is accountable to our city officials and to the community that we serve. There are multiple community advisory committees within the county, some located in your cities. Local sheriffs, volunteers, and reserves, which volunteer their time to provide service to your communities. Community academies, we actually do community academies and do academies for city council members. Unfortunately, we started one in February. It got through the beginning of March, and then obviously due to what's going on, we've had to delay it. But we can't wait to get that started again and get more of our city folks in here to really learn about our department and about what we do here. And then there's oversight groups, including the Civilian Oversight Commission and the Inspector General. Next slide, please. The reason why we're able to provide the service that we do is 51350, the California Government Code, which is known as Gonzales Law. Basically, it outlines the costs that can be passed on to contract cities for deputies providing a service, for us to be able to provide a service to you. And it's very clear. There are a couple other entities, such as board policy from the County Board of Supervisors, that can help guide in what we recover. However, there are costs that the department has to provide to all members of, or all constituents within the county, regardless if they're in an incorporated city or not, and none of those costs can be passed on to contract cities, and we'll get to that in just a moment. Next slide, please. So we're going to dive into real quick the multiple different ways that your cities can purchase service and how we provide service to your cities and prove compliance that we're providing the service that you paid for. And this is where it gets interesting, because our department provides service, people provide service. Obviously, deputy sheriffs are out there in your streets working 24/7, 365. However, what you're purchasing are increments of time. And we'll break it down to 4 of our most common used or common purchase units. The first one you can see on the top there, it's called the 40-hour non-relief deputy sheriff service unit. That's generally for an individual. If there's someone that you want to provide a specific service, let's say community relations, and you want one person to provide it and nobody else. And that means that that deputy is going to show up to work approximately 40 hours a week, but they're going to take some compensated time off at some time during the year. And when they take that compensated time off, there's no relief, so no one else is going to backfill behind them. Usually it's not patrol positions, but sometimes it can be, and we'll get to that in a moment. The next is a 40-hour position with relief. So let's say you wanted a position that's going to be there Monday through Friday every week, regardless. then we'll assign a deputy to it, but the department on the back end is going to have to just assign relief. So we're going to have to assign more than two people to that assignment so that there's relief for when that person uses compensated time off for not being there. The most common service level for providing patrol in all of our cities is the 56-hour service unit. That service unit combines multiple deputies for relief, and it's 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So if your city says, I want service from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m. every day, that's what you're going to purchase with the 56-hour unit. If you want round-the-clock service with one patrol car in the field round the clock, 365, it would be 3 56-hour units. So you capture 3 8-hour shifts per day. And then it's up to the department to manage the staffing and the relief on all the deputies required to provide that service. The last is a 70-hour deputy sheriff service unit. Again, that's going to be 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365. So that's really important for some cities that have influx of people or have an influx of traffic, and they want some overlap from one shift to another. It's great in increasing the amount of personnel available at any time within the city to provide service while still getting that 24-hour service as well. Generally, we don't contract, like I mentioned, for a specific number of personnel, but a specific level of service. So for a quick example, let's say your city purchases through a variety of this menu of deputy sheriff service units equal to 1 million minutes per year. And let's say it's on a calendar year to make it easy, even though it's on a fiscal year. Now, on January 1st, at midnight, it just struck midnight, and it's the new year, I log on as a deputy. I log off at 6 a.m. That's 480 minutes. So after my shift, when I log off, I'm the only person working that first shift. You're going to now have 999,520 minutes that remaining for the rest of the calendar year. And by the end of the year, we've got to be between 98 and 102% of that million minutes that you purchased by every log being reduced from that million minutes. If that's kind of an easy way to look at it. If I can get the next slide, please, we'll talk a little bit about how these units are purchased. Give it a couple more clicks to fill in those. Thank you very much. So we have a 56-hour unit. Again, we want service. There you go. Thank you, Marcel. Keep going along till all the stars are filled out through the week, please. So if we're providing that service, we're going to have one deputy working Monday through Friday, or Sunday through Thursday in this example, but there's still 2 shifts left over. Well, that's going to be Friday and Saturday, where we have a second deputy. The advantage to the contract city in purchasing a 56-hour unit, you need 2 people to complete that work. So an independent city, an independent police department in the county has to provide 2 people, salary, employee benefits, and all the overheads with those 2 people to provide it one 56-hour unit, where you just purchase the time. The department provides both deputies to provide that service, but you're not paying for the entire second deputy, only for the level of time that's required to fulfill our contractual obligations there. And that keeps that keeps our costs toward the cities less because you're not purchasing that entire second deputy. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is our relief factors. So on the back end, this is kind of a look at see how we decide, or we're able to figure out how many people do we need to assign to a station for each service unit that is purchased. So if you see on the column on the third column over to the right, you'll see personnel required, and you'll see a bunch of decimals. Well, we can't split deputy sheriffs up, so we always have to round up. But with cities that purchase multiple service units and multiple types, you guys have seen your 575s, you know, there's a good amount of service that each city provides. We get closer to that rounded number the more we provide. So we're never really providing more than one more full deputy than what's required even for a 30 or 40 deputy contract. So you see the service levels we just mentioned a moment ago. Top left, we'll start with deputy sheriff service unit, the non-relief. So no relief for vacancies. You see personnel required 1. The annual hours, 1789, and then the minutes converted over there. So if you purchase someone with no relief behind them, then we only provide 1 person because there's no relief. The annual hours, you'll see 1,789 hours. What we do is we look at all of the timesheets for all of our deputy sheriffs assigned to patrol. We do it around the entire department, but For this model, for the model for contract cities, it's specifically patrol. And we look at how much compensated time off or how much time off do they take per calendar year. And we'll get an average on all the people assigned to patrol, how many hours per year do we expect them to show up at work? So it's an actual number, and it varies slightly year to year, but it sticks right around 1789, and we've been successful in using that number for a number of years. But we do a studies on a regular basis to make sure that we're accurate with that number. The second one's the 40-hour unit, 5 days a week with 8 hours a day. We require 1.166 people and to provide that service, and it's 2086 for the annual hours, and that's just multiplying the number of hours in a year for that 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. And then we just divide the 1789 by the 2086, and we get the 1.166 to tell us how many people to assign. The same is true for the 56-hour unit, 7 days a week, 8 hours a day. 2920 is the number of hours we need to provide contractually to you per year for that service unit, and we need to supply 1.632 deputies to provide that service. 70 hours is obviously going to be bumped up a little bit more, so we're providing 10 hours a day. 3650 on the annual hours, we need 2.040 people. So if your city purchases one deputy sheriff service unit as a 70-hour unit, we have to provide 3 deputies to cover that 0.04 level of service, or else we'll be short on our minutes at the end of the year. And that's where that cost savings can come in for contract cities. Next slide, please. So if you see the cost of a deputy sheriff service unit, which we'll get to in just a moment, you'll see that it seems a little bit high that no deputies that I know make that much. It's because we have a single price service unit. So all the overheads, all the expenditures that go into providing that service are included in one cost. To make it simple, it's a simple menu to choose from. You want this level of service by the number of minutes or the coverage that you want for your city, and this is the price to do that. So the cost of a deputy sheriff service unit is going to include some overheads, and those overheads are going to be listed right here. The station supervision, so there's sergeants, lieutenants, and the captain. The station support, so all the clerical and the secretaries in the back. The detectives for investigation, and the dispatch to coordinate calls for service with deputies in the field. There is some department administrative support included, equipment and supplies for the station and for the deputies. There are some county support costs, which we'll get to in a minute, and of course liability, which Mr. Scholl will get to shortly. Next slide, please. So included in those costs above for the deputy sheriff is salaries for our employees, some built-in overtime, as we can expect and do studies to see how much overtime we spend for report writing in some cases, shift holdover when there's an emergency that requires people to be held over shifts, benefits for the employees, services and supplies, auto and maintenance, and other support. We'll get into more detail in just a moment. Next slide, please. And now we can see the cost. This is for a non-relief, that 40-hour non-relief deputy sheriff service unit where there's no relief behind them. Top left, salary and wages. So from all the generalist is going to be a deputy. The terms are interchangeable. So the salaries and wages of their supervision is also built in, and their clerical support, which you can see directly below them. Employee benefits for those positions are included, the sworn and non-sworn, the support staff. Services and supplies for auto and other on the top right. The administrative support to provide support to that deputy so they can provide service to you in the field. The direct patrol support, and then the support for each unit that's allocated to Contract Law Enforcement Bureau so we can provide the service in managing the contracts. There's a bit of overtime built in to each one, so we don't have to go back to the contract cities at the end of the year and say, oh, well, in order to provide service, we did have to provide a little bit of overtime that's reasonable that had to do with shift holdover, report writing, et cetera, for other emergencies. We build it in on the front end, and then we adjust it at the end of the year in the next cost model. So if we didn't use as much as allocated, there's a credit the next cost model. If we use a little bit more, then it's going to be rolled into the next year's cost model. And that brings up a good point I want to just remind everyone. When it comes to developing these rates, we're in a cost recovery model. So this year, the rates that you see right there for that deputy sheriff service unit, that was the amount that the department spent to provide service to the contract cities in fiscal year 18-19. So we're not allowed to project what our costs may be to provide service to you in the future, we have to go on cost with money that's already been spent. So that is the money that the department's already spent to provide service several fiscal years ago. So for instance, this fiscal year, there have been a lot of cost-saving measures that the department's taken due to the financial strain put on the county and essentially the economy. And we hope that that will provide relief to contract cities through a lower rate increase in 22-23. If you think about that, we're going to be recovering the costs that we're spending now. Next slide, please. So it's going to go over a little bit what I already discussed, but we'll touch on a little bit right here. Per Gonzales, the county by law shall charge the city all the costs that are incurred in providing the services so contracted are authorized. Our goal is to determine what it cost, this is in the past, that a sheriff's department to staff a particular deputy sheriff service unit with the deputy sheriff in a radio car out on patrol. That includes all that support costs. So the department and our job is to provide the auditor controller for the county with all the numbers. They cost out each organizational unit and they provide these rates back to us. Just to be clear, the sheriff's department does not develop these rates on its own. Everything is sent to the auditor controller and they send it back to us, and then we provide them to you as those costs for the deputy sheriff service units. The individual line units or units that we classify within the department are line countywide, charged and excluded, and we'll go over that real quickly for you. Next slide, please. These are considered the line units within the department. You can read them: custody, courts, patrol, transit services, Metrolink, community colleges, STAR, which is done through our schools, the Task Force for Regional Auto Theft Prevention, special positions, and parking enforcement. The countywide units, these are units that are not passed on to the contract cities. The sheriff's department has to provide all of this service to everyone within the county without charging unincorporated area residents or contract city or independent city residents extra. And you can see communications records. Scientific services is the crime lab, reserve forces, emergency operations bureau, Safe Streets Bureau, which is our gang enforcement, Special Enforcement Bureau, which is a SWAT team, Special Victims Bureau, recruit training, arson explosives, cargo theft, fraud and cyber crimes, major crimes, homicide, and narcotics. Next slide, please. So these are organizational units within the department that do a portion of each one of these units do get passed on. And essentially, all of these units are integral in the support for those deputy sheriff service units to provide service to all of our cities. Next slide, please. Thank you. And these are the units which are completely excluded. None of these are in addition to countywide. Office of the Sheriff, Office of the Undersheriff, Office of Assistant Sheriff, all the commanders, communications, records and identification, scientific services, which is the crime lab, emergency operations, Sheriff's Information Bureau, and Detective Division, all those countywide units we mentioned earlier. And for the sheriff, undersheriff, assistant sheriff, commanders, if an independent city had decided to have their own police department, all of those costs, they wouldn't have a sheriff or undersheriff. So those costs they wouldn't have those themselves. So therefore, we don't pass those on because they're irrelevant to each city if they were to have their own police department. Next slide, please. We talked about cost recovery through the rate, and that our rate this year, 2021, at 5.57%, which we provided to all of you in February at our conference, is recovering costs from 18-19. So you kind of look back 2 years to see what was happening at the time and why the rates would be increased at a certain level. Again, we hope that due to the incredible cost-saving measures the county and the sheriff has done for our department, that some of those would be passed on the next couple fiscal years. But it's clear here to see our averages and rates, and there are spikes at time, but we hope it to correct itself in the next few fiscal years. Next slide, please. So this is just put into two fields so you can see we've already discussed this, the support units that are included in the contract cost model and the ones that are excluded. So the top portion included, bottom portion excluded that were listed earlier. And last slide, please. And one more click. or a couple more. If you don't mind, a few more until we get down to the email address. And again, we did rush through this. I do want to make our services available to go into detail and to get into the weeds on any of this, or to provide this presentation in a more lengthy format with a question and answer as we kind of go along to any contract city. But I want to thank you for your time, Marcel, and thanks for letting us provide this to our city partners.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. We really appreciate you for coming on here. What I'm going to do now is we're going to switch over to John Scholl from CJPIA, and then we're going to take questions. So for those of the people that are attending, we have quite a few in the audience. There's a Q&A button up there. If you want to start typing in those questions right now, we'll take care of them once we get through. And now I'm going to hand it over to John Scholl, who's going to present on the liability trust fund.
Thank you, Marcel. Let me share my screen here real quick. And it says I can't do that yet. There we go. And we'll go into slide mode. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little about the Liability Trust Fund. Appreciate the Sheriff's Department providing the background on the contract concept. In the history of the contracting model, the cost associated with liability have been dealt with a number of different ways, and so my role today is to talk through that. First, to give you a little bit of history of the Liability Trust Fund, the discussion of the Oversight Committee and Claims Board, and then what are some of the current issues that are facing the trust fund. So just an overview of the history. There was a period of time that it was an insured program that the county was responsible for. Then there was a change in the insurance industry and it became difficult to insure. We went to an assumption of liability that was later changed to joint indemnification. Then there was an effort to create another program. And then we got to the Oversight Committee and a few other items. And I'm going to go through those in a little bit of detail. So in the beginning, as was stated a few moments ago, the Lakewood Plan started out and services were provided at the cost of fines and forfeitures. That included the liability as well as the cost of providing actual sheriff's patrol services. There was insurance that was purchased at the time, and it was part of the contract. In 1977, the insurance market was really tightening, and it was making it difficult for local agencies, local governments to buy insurance, and the county began self-insuring the Liability Trust Fund. So in order to do that, they created a surcharge, and there was the assumption of liability agreement. Basically, it says, we, the county, will provide you service to the cities. We'll provide you sheriff service as well as public works and other contracted services. But obviously today we're talking mostly about the Sheriff's Department. But we will provide the sheriff service to you, and we will be responsible for any liability associated with the services being delivered. We will pay for that obligation, that liability, from a surcharge or from a fund that is funded by the cities with a surcharge on their contract. So originally the surcharge was 2% for all contracted services, public works, sheriff, building and planning, any of those things. In 1989, there was an audit that was conducted. Some have rumored that it was instigated by the city managers saying that that 2% was way too much. Some have said that the county council's office decided they should do an audit. Irrespective of who's to blame, there was an audit done. It was determined that the county wasn't being managed in a centralized manner, and they wanted to consolidate it within the county council's operation. So county council became responsible for the liability trust fund and managing claims associated with delivery of services. The cities really didn't have much say in the process. And so the City Managers Committee of Contract Cities Association created a small subcommittee, some familiar names like Bill Holt and Dennis Quartermarsh and a few other characters like that. They were involved in working with the county and county staff to try to make the city's views about these claims brought forward, and that they would impact the way the claims are being handled. So that subcommittee continued for quite a few years, actually. As part of this audit that the county conducted, it was determined by the county that there may not have been enough money in the fund. So to the question of the city managers allegedly, you know, be careful what you ask for, you may find out something you don't really want to know. The county felt that it needed more money. The county counsel's office felt there was a need for more money in the fund, but they only took an interim step initially, and that was to change the rate to 3% for sheriff and public works and 2% for other services. Contract cities, still questioning whether that was the right number, continued to push the issue, and the county was concerned that the rates weren't enough. So contract cities thought it was too low, thought it was too high, county thought it was too low. Well, an independent study was done, and it showed it should have been as high as 13% for the sheriff's department, which tells us that there wasn't enough money in the trust fund in that period, and the county wanted to raise rates up to 13%. Well, obviously, Contract Cities Association, in one of its stronger moves and more important roles, was advocating on behalf of all the cities, and it was agreed ultimately that the rates would be 6.5% for the sheriff's department and 3% for all other services. Now, Sherm Block was, I believe, running for sheriff at the time in one of his many elections, and he told the cities, "I'll make it 6%. So it was ultimately resolved at implementation at 6% for sheriff and 3% for other services. That went on for a few years, and it was going pretty well. Then there was a move toward trying to get the cities more involved. There had been two large cases, one called Talamavayo. It was a incident in the city of Cerritos. And then there was another case called Hershey, which I believe was in the city of Pico Rivera. And these cases were very large cases and became even larger as all avenues of appeal were exercised. And the cities had no voice in what was being done, but ultimately the money was coming out of the liability trust fund. So the surcharge that the cities were paying in went into the fund, and then the county was deciding how to handle the claims. The cities weren't particularly involved in this discussion. That didn't sit well with a lot of the folks at the Contract Cities Association, and discussions began to try to come up with a better way or a different way to manage the claims. What came out of those discussions was an effort to create a separate joint powers authority just for handling the claims associated with the sheriff's department. Ultimately, in the discussions, it also included all of the other contract services. Contract cities, California JPIA, were working toward creation of this joint powers agreement. And then the county got involved, and they said, this is something that we would do if you can get all the cities who are contracting with the sheriff to agree with it. A separate joint powers authority was created. It was called the Self-Insurance Authority for Effective Risk Management, SAFER. Most of the cities signed on to that, and discussions began with the county about transferring management of the claims to SAFER. By December of '98, unfortunately, or fortunate, depending how you look at it, just factually, in December of 1998, the city managers determined that there were a few holdout cities that were not going to agree, and the transfer of management of claims was not going to transfer over to SAFER. So those discussions led to the county and the cities recognizing that the cities really did deserve more voice in the process. Their claims, their money, the county's claims being used to pay for the city with the city's money, it made sense for the cities to have more involvement. During the 1998-1999 period, when the contract cities determined that there was not going to be a transfer of control, the discussions began with the county CAO, David Jansen, and members of the Board of Supervisors about how can the cities have a greater voice. Ultimately, what was created was the Liability Trust Fund Oversight Committee. And it was a partnership among the county departments and the cities, the contracting cities, to have a voice in the process. Initially, the Liability Trust Fund Oversight Committee was responsible for looking at claims, and then County Council realized that, well, this is not actually a county board. We need to create a county claims board. And so in 2000, there was a separate claims board created, which is staffed, is comprised of the same representatives who are on the oversight committee. So basically, there are two committees, two entities that play very similar roles, parallel to one another. The claims board has a settlement authority of up to $100,000 within claims against the contracting cities, or against the Sheriff's Department for services in the contracting cities. And anything above $100,000, the claims board makes a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors, and that to the county claims board, which ultimately gets to the Board of Supervisors. And in the 25 years I've been involved with this, or nearly 25 years I've been involved with this, the county Board of Supervisors has almost always agreed with that recommendation of the Liability Trust Fund Claims Board. Almost, because in 2006, there was a hiccup in the relationship. There had been a deputy who had been, while on duty, participating in some illegal sexual acts that ultimately resulted in claims against the city, the county, and a resolution of those claims by some significant indemnity payments to the victims. The Contract Cities Association and the Liability Trust Fund Oversight Committee and Claims Board all felt that this was not the type of thing that should be covered by the Liability Trust Fund. The Board of Supervisors and their justice deputies disagreed with that, and ultimately withdrew the money from the Liability Trust Fund to pay for those settlement obligations. The Contract Cities Association actually ultimately sued the county to have a recovery of those funds that had been taken. And in lieu of going to court, there was a settlement of the issue, which led to if and when there is a deputy who is convicted of a variety of sexual misconduct, the county general fund will split the indemnity payments with the Liability Trust Fund 50-50. So that's the county city special indemnity agreement. I'm glad to say that since this happened in about 2006, ultimately resolved in 2009, there have been very few situations where this issue has arisen. I think that's a testament to the Sheriff's Department taking a much closer eye at what deputies are doing and the policies and procedures that they have in place to prevent those opportunities. So that got us to the special indemnity agreement. And since then, we've really been back to a place of the cities and the county working very well together. The Oversight Committee and Claims Board, it really has worked very well. So let me give you a little bit of who and what makes up the Oversight Committee and what's its role, and then the Claims Board. So first, as I said before, started in 1999. The Oversight Committee was created to give cities a voice in the process. Now, the first thing that the Oversight Committee said was, we need some insurance on this exposure because it was fully self-insured by the trust fund. We needed to buy some excess insurance. We did so. And that was a big expense at the time, and it's even a bigger expense today. But it's a very important expense because the excess insurers have played an important role in maintaining the fiscal stability of the trust fund. Part of that fiscal stability is annually conducting financial audits, actuarial studies to ensure that there's enough money in reserve for the claims that are presented. The Oversight Committee is also responsible for determining what the surcharge rates should be for upcoming contributions by the members of the contracting cities. We'll talk in a few minutes, but right now it's 11%. At one point it was 2%. There's been years when it's been 0. It just as a result of the types of claims activity and the other expenses associated with delivering the service. The Oversight Committee is also responsible for working with the Sheriff's Department, and they play an active role in the contract city, in the Liability Trust Fund Oversight Committee meetings. They are there to answer questions. They provide presentations about risk management activities within the department. Very important partner in the oversight function, as well as in their function in providing services to the cities. One way that California JPIA is involved, and many of you know the history, California JPIA actually was spawned from the Contract Cities Association many years ago when the insurance crisis first hit, and cities individually, unrelated to contract cities, cities were, unrelated to the contracts with the county, cities were needing insurance for their other activities. Contract Cities Association created a self-insurance fund that ultimately became the California Joint Powers Insurance Authority. So we are kindred spirits, and we have a lot of things in common. The California JPIA's liability program and workers' compensation program are unrelated to the Liability Trust Fund. Our relationship with the Liability Trust Fund is that under contract, California JPIA helps with administrative and risk management support. We are the ones responsible for negotiating with the insurance brokers and carriers. We are the ones responsible for managing the actuarial studies and auditors and things of that nature. So that's our role. What is a claims board? Well, as I said earlier, initially the Oversight Committee was looking at claims until County Counsel's office recognized that, well, these people don't have any county affiliation officially. They should not be looking at the claims. So a claims board was created. I've already told you about how the claims board has levels of authority. The representation on the claims committee and the Liability Trust Fund Oversight Committee is chosen by the contracting cities. It's reflective of the 4 department patrol divisions, as well as an at-large member, city council, and city manager. And so here's your list. Our current president is Mark Warnick from the city of Lomita. On the left-hand side, we have our members. The first several are city council members, and the final 5 are city managers. And then on the member list is also Marcel as the executive director of the California Contract Cities Association. And there are 5 manager alternates and 5 council member alternates as well. So one of the most important things we do each year is an actuarial study. Look at the claims, look at the money that's set aside and reserved for those claims, and determine how much are we going to need in the future to pay for those claims, and project how much are we going to need in the future to pay for claims that are going to happen in the future. So we pay actuaries an awful lot of money because they are really good at doing these sorts of estimates, and they determine how much we should have to pay for our claims that are coming forward. Couple of good things have been happening of late. We have started to see an improvement in the actuarial status of the fund. There was a time when the fund was very healthy. When this all started, the fund was very poor, very unhealthy. The fund became healthy because of a number of good years of risk management at the Sheriff's Department, and I think also a great deal of good luck. That changed a few years back, and there were a number of very large cases, and our insurance, our liability trust fund surcharge went from 6% to what is now 11%. The actuarial study actually recommended that it go to 11.4% for this coming year, or for 2020, 2021, and 12% for 21, 22. The Contract Cities Association implored the County Board of Supervisors to allow it to remain flat at 11%, and they did so. There are a couple other things that we need to be concerned about, and that's, of course, large losses that continue to come in. We are looking for ways to save some money within the fund and the relationship with the county. And here's a quick look at those surcharge rates. So we were 6%. We dropped to 0 for a couple of years when it was super funded, and now it's back up to 11%. Perhaps we shouldn't have gone all the way to 0. Current issues, obviously, social justice issues and the impacts that's having on juries, judges, verdicts. It's very impactful on how much money is in the trust fund. We have had a number of high exposure losses. There is certainly concern that affects the first bullet point in regard to the relationship of the current sheriff with the current board of supervisors. There are times when it feels like that's getting better, and then there are setbacks. So it's hard to know what's happening there. Huge benefit for our buying insurance as we are actually starting to see the rollout of body-worn cameras. At least it's been approved. So that should help us a lot. And there have been some discussions of revisiting the assumption of liability agreement and joint indemnity agreement to ensure that the cities are only being held responsible for appropriate contracted items, nothing that might be on the fringes there. So I'm going to stop at that point because that's way more than my time, and I appreciate any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate it. We have a couple questions already for the Contract Law Enforcement Bureau folks, and I'll give you guys a couple more minutes, and then hopefully you'll have some questions for John as we move forward. But I'm gonna ask Sergio and Brian. There's a couple questions that I have right now. First one question is, what happens when there's a call for service outside the 40, 56, or 70 hours on a contract?
Hi, it's Brian Aguilera here, Sheriff's Department. I think there may have been a misunderstanding between a call for service and a deputy sheriff's service unit. Those increments of time are amounts of time that are purchased by a city where they want patrolled, that they're city patrolled by a deputy sheriff. So a call for service is very different, that it likely won't last longer than hopefully a shift or a few hours. And if a call for service lasts longer than 8 hours, if it's a complex crime scene, then the initial assigned deputies may stay there, or they may hand it off to the next shift who will come on and fulfill their duties for them. Hope I was able to clarify there's a big difference between a deputy sheriff's service unit, which is purchased by a city to provide an increment of time for the cities for us to provide service, and a call for service, which means we got a phone call about a crime or something else we need to respond to, and deputies are sent to that location to handle that. That's what we refer to as a call for service. So very different, but we'd be more than happy to provide more information if the person wants to reach out.
Great, thanks, Brian. The next question is, what efforts does the Contract Law Enforcement Bureau provide cities to determine the right level of police services we need, and how often is this audited? We'd like to have information on how CLEB uses data or analytics to provide guidance to cities so that we can find that sweet spot of not being over-policed or under-policed. That's a really good question.
Okay, it's Sergio Escobedo here. Yeah, determining the right level of service, it typically starts with the unit commander as or the station unit commander as the de facto chief of police, working with the city manager. It is done on a yearly basis when the contracts are signed. The determination is really based on the crime stats, calls for service, response times. We as a department will we have a standard of response times, and we try to keep it within that. I believe routine service is within 60 minutes, priorities within 30, and then emergency within 6 minutes. So there's our 7 minutes. Correct me if I'm wrong. 60-20-10. 60-20-10 for priority and emergency response times. So the station captain is your first point of contact. We as CLEB, as contract law, we do not determine what a station's service level should be, but we will provide the research if need be for historical service levels. But it really starts at the station level with the unit commander. And those are done at, like I said, on an annual basis prior to the signing of the contract. And that's something that city manager would really have to work with the station captain to determine. So that's that's where their role should fit in. Now, per the contractual law enforcement agreement, the sheriff does have final authority on what a safe minimum deployment should be. If there's a disagreement with the minimal staffing deployment, it will go up the chain of command for negotiations, starting with, like I said, with the station captain, then with the division commander, division chief, and up to the assistant sheriff for final determination. But there is that, I believe it's 2.3 of the 5-year agreement, where there is a chain of command to follow when those negotiations are not matching with what the city wants to deploy or pay for. So I hope that answers your question, but we do provide that support to the station as for historical purposes only.
Yeah, thanks, Sergio. I know when I was a council member, that was a question that came up a lot to the station captain is, you know, do we have the right number of deputies? Do we have the right number of cars? And it kind of, it varies, it flexes depending on the time of the week, sometimes the time of the year, but obviously you have to buy this contract, right? So you want to flex those folks so where you might use them, let's say for like a special event. You might apply some of those minutes to like a carnival or something that you're a summer concert or something to have more presence out there when you know it's going to be slower as far as, you know, like having deputies patrolling and stuff like that. So that was one of the things I always appreciated with the department is that flexibility, because you're buying that set number of minutes and you can apply those minutes, you know, you can make adjustments throughout the year as long as it's coordinated with the captain, obviously.
Right, yes, the captain really has the authority to make different deployment changes. And a lot of those like carnivals or special events, if you have an SAO team, they work with the city manager will work with station captain to flex those resources versus general law, which are your 40, 50, 60 hour cars is for general law enforcement services to answer calls for service. And your SAO teams are the flex teams that could be utilized for different purposes. And there are some instances where those teams are overused to where the station captain may request a supplemental service. So that's where the overtime comes in for those additional services to provide for a concert or for a big park event. And so if it's outside the scope of what the special assignment deputies are able to do because they're taxed with different assignments, then the station captain will request that additional supplemental service. So again, it's really the negotiations with the unit commander, and that's where that relationship with the city manager plays a key role, is to negotiate where they could flex those service levels and where we need to supplement on top of that.
Excellent. Thank you, Sergio. Okay, I have a couple more questions, and if you have anybody else that's attending out there, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A panel and we'll get to them. We're running short on time, but we'll try to get through a couple more. So this question is, I don't know if John or Sergio or Brian, any of you know the question is, I've always wondered this myself. The question is, why is the Sheriff's Department funding mechanism different than LA County Fire? We all know that the fire department, there's fire districts that are paid through our property taxes, but when it comes to law enforcement, there was no built-in mechanism to pay for those services, right? Obviously, now law enforcement, we can find ourselves very, very expensive. And even with the fire department earlier this year in March, they wanted to do a supplemental sort of funding to update their equipment and stuff, which unfortunately failed. But do you have any idea why that funding mechanism and the contract and sort of the relationship as a whole is different between fire and sheriff?
Well,
That's a good question.
Go ahead, John.
I can take a quick stab at part of the discussion, which is, and we've looked at a few different models over the years at the Liability Trust Fund, because there are other counties that do the liability portion differently. Sometimes they include it in the contract. Sometimes they actually are like the fire department, where it is a district and it's managed, you know, basically on your property tax bill. You don't. And the real issue for the contract cities is the local control piece of it. And I think many of the cities in Los Angeles County have felt local control was important enough to make it a separate item, managed separately, rather than it just being on the property tax and being, you know, kind of out of sight, out of mind.
Makes sense. Sergio, Brian, do you guys have anything to add to that? Is it pretty much the same?
Pretty much the same. John hit the nail on the head. It's the local control aspect of it is where you see the separation. We could always reach out to the audit controller and see if they have any other methodology as to why that's done and get back to you to disseminate that information.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. I appreciate that. And then this is the last question I have. I don't have any more questions in the Q&A panel. This is actually my question. And so, John, this is something that you mentioned earlier. You were talking about way back in the day that the funding agreement for, when the Gonzales Law was passed was that the county would accept the fines and forfeitures in lieu of, funding. So my question is, and maybe Sergio and Brian, you guys might be able to answer this too. Where do the fines go now? Like if I have a deputy patrolling my street that's working traffic and they're citing people for various running red lights, whatever it might be, where do those fines go now, and what portion of that comes back to cities?
I'm going to leave it to those guys because I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah.
We've got Sergeant Julie Lowe has a little bit of background for that to provide to you guys.
I don't know if you can see her. She's on my far left here.
Hi there, everybody. So I believe it was last year this question was posed to us by the city of Pico Rivera, and they were trying to determine what portion of the traffic citations actually were attributed to the city. And so at the time, Lieutenant Squire assisted in answering this question, but ultimately it was way above what we do here at Contract Law. What he was able to find was a flow chart of how the process was and how the funds were divided up through various entities. And the flow chart took up the entire page of a 8x10 sheet of paper. And what we ultimately discovered is once each entity takes their chunk of the pie, the city is ultimately left with very little of that revenue from the citation. I can research the flow chart to see if I can find it, and then I'll pass it on to Captain Escobedo, and then you can share it with Marcel.
Right. I'll get that flow chart, Marcel, and send it your way to disseminate.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it, because one of the things I remember going back to, my time as a council member, when we had our public safety, for example, if we're citing for whether it be fireworks or illegal parking or whatever else it was that money, 100% of it, except of course with the fines and the administrative costs, came back to the city. So I'm wondering, they're pretty hefty fines when all of the fees are added on. If you get a speeding ticket, let's say, the flat fine just for the infraction is, could be like $100, but when they tack on the fees, you're looking at $300-400 sometimes. So it would make sense to me that, if we're contracting with the sheriff's department for you to patrol our cities and you write a ticket, that some portion of that should come back, right? Because if I'm Downey and I have my own police department and they write tickets, I'm sure some portion of that comes back to the city, because it's got to flow back through, to help provide for that public safety aspect, right? So hopefully you guys, I'm sure you'll be able to get me a good answer, and we'll be able to look at that. That might be something we look at as part of our public safety working group and see, how do we figure that out, or why is it being distributed fairly, and why is the state or whomever taking big portions of it. But I don't have any more questions. We're 5 minutes over now. I want to say thank you again, Contract Law Enforcement Bureau, John Scholl. You guys are always incredibly responsive. You're always amazing. When we ask you, we're going to hear again from John in a couple of weeks. Next week we have we have the November ballot elections, I think, our next week. We have 2 more sessions of this. This is our virtual Fall Educational Summit. So again, thank you guys for taking the time to spend with us. Thank you out there for everyone that attended, that participated. We're going to take this recording. We're going to put it up on our YouTube page. I think you guys provided an excellent overview for as short a time as it was. I think that was one of the things that we had been really lacking when we have new elected officials, when we have folks coming in, new city managers that never managed a contract law city, to know what the expectation should be, what they're getting when they contract with law enforcement. I think you hopefully opened a lot of eyes today to really look at, why the contract is the way it is, how it works. And of course, we always have more work to do, but this is a good sort of, basic knowledge starting point of how the contract works and what our relationship is at its foundation with the Sheriff's Department. So thank you guys again. Thank you for attending. I'll talk to you, Sergio, Brian, John. Appreciate you. Have a great day, everybody.